On Saturday, an American F-22 Raptor shot down a Chinese surveillance balloon off the coast of South Carolina. In the days leading up to this intercept, the balloon had traversed the US mainland and portions of Canada, leaving a flood of conspiracy theories in its wake. Let's talk about this balloon and dispel some of the myths and misinformation flooding the internet. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is a special edition of Air Power. So the F-22 Raptor gets its first confirmed air-to-air kill on, of all days, my birthday. So of course I had to come back and talk to you guys about it. And to be clear right off the bat, this Chinese surveillance balloon floating its way across the US certainly did represent a serious development in diplomatic tensions between the US and China. But the Defense Department was clear throughout that this system itself posed little to no direct threat to the American people. In other words, this event is a big deal, but not because of any physical danger it represented. I thought it would be helpful if we went through and identified some of the really common misinformation and disinformation narratives surrounding this Chinese surveillance balloon, as well as some of the more pressing questions that I've seen pop up in the comments under my videos on TikTok and in stories around the internet in general. So let's start with the basics. This balloon was shot down about 6 miles off the coast of South Carolina by a US Air Force F-22 Raptor hailing from the 1st Fighter Wing at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. US territorial waters extend 12 miles out to sea, meaning this balloon was shot down while still flying over what is legally considered to be America's sovereign territory. The weapon used was an AIM-9X Sidewinder missile, America's most advanced infrared-guided or heat-seeking air-to-air missile, and the latest iteration of the long-serving Sidewinder missile family. The F-22 Raptor reportedly launched the AIM-9X from an altitude of about 58,000 feet, a notable height considering the F-22's disclosed service ceiling is listed as simply above 50,000 feet. The AIM-9X reportedly hit the balloon somewhere between 60 and 65,000 feet, making this potentially the highest altitude successful intercept of all time. I'll have to get back to you on that one. So, if you're asking why it wasn't shot down sooner, the official answer is simply that the American government wanted to ensure that it didn't risk hurting anyone or damaging any property, as the balloon, estimated to be about 3 school buses in length, hurtled to the ground after being shot down. Even over sparsely populated areas like Montana, that much debris raining down from 65,000 feet could cause some real problems, whether for the one person who owns the property or, God forbid, it landed on a bridge or a school or something. But the secondary reason behind allowing this balloon to continue floating was probably its value as an intelligence-gathering asset, not for China, but for the US. Defense officials have been clear that they mitigated this balloon's ability to gather or transmit any data. In other words, it wasn't sending any information back to China. And once the US had mitigated those intelligence gathering capabilities, the US could observe it freely, sponging data from its systems and assessing its overall capabilities in a pretty risk-free environment, learning more about this system, what it can do, and what its likely intents are than America otherwise could have in a much longer period of time. But let's delve a bit deeper into that concern that this balloon was allowed to continue collecting sensitive data for China as it traversed the US, because it seems pretty evident that that wasn't the case. Not only did US defense officials state that they were mitigating its ability to collect or transmit data, but savvy Twitter and Reddit users were quick to point out the presence of aircraft like the RC-135 rivet joint orbiting the balloon as it crossed the country. The rivet joint is a heavily modified Boeing C-135 Stratolifter, a sibling to Boeing's civilian 707, that's just jam-packed with electronic warfare and surveillance equipment. The aircraft carries a crew of more than 30 to operate its broad array of systems, which include the capability to identify and locate signals broadcasting anywhere in the electromagnetic spectrum. Many have also asked why China would use balloons at all in this era of spy satellites. But the truth is, spy satellites only carry a finite amount of fuel for their onboard thrusters, meant to adjust their orbital course. And as a result, satellite orbits are pretty predictable. Hiding something from most spy satellites orbiting high overhead really just becomes a question of tucking your secrets away during the times that you know the satellite has a direct line of sight. The predictability of satellite orbits reduces their spying potential, and tracking these orbital bodies in real time is one of many jobs taken over by the US Space Force once it was established. But balloons are also a low-cost and surprisingly low-signature platform for data collection. In other words, they're inexpensive to field in numbers, and despite their size, aren't always that easy to detect. They have nearly no carbon emissions or infrared signature to pick up on, and these massive balloons even often boast a very small radar cross-section, something similar to a bird, because radar waves tend to go right through the balloon's fabric. These systems also have some limited navigational capabilities, which allows them to loiter, which is something very difficult for a satellite to pull off. And finally, it often takes about a decade to get a new spy satellite into orbit, but thanks to modern miniaturized systems, balloons can serve as a pretty effective intelligence gathering platform for not all that much money. And while we're talking about these balloons being pretty tough to detect and track, let's address the next very sensational narrative I've seen surface over the past few days. This idea that the balloon could be carrying an EMP weapon, a nuclear weapon, or some kind of a biological weapon. First off, the easiest one, dispersing a biological agent from 65,000 feet up or anywhere in that area just wouldn't work. The agent would be so dispersed by the time it hit the ground it wouldn't be concentrated enough to have any effect on people. This is just one of many reasons why the chemtrail conspiracy theory is so silly. Now, EMPs, or electromagnetic pulses, can damage electronic devices over a large swath of territory, but the amount of energy required to do so is immense. In fact, the most feasible way to affect an entire region of the United States with an EMP would be to detonate a nuclear weapon at high altitude above the nation. And it's important to note that America's nuclear missile silos, like many military installations and hardware, are hardened against EMP attacks. And that brings us to concerns that the balloon itself may have been carrying a nuclear weapon. Well, the fact of the matter is, if China were interested in detonating a nuclear weapon over the US, missiles would just make way more sense. Unlike balloons, missiles allow for a high degree of precision. And we all know for sure that even with America's ground-based mid-course defense system, we could not stop a full-scale launch of China's nuclear weapons. In other words, if China wanted to start World War III, a balloon would be a pretty crappy way to do it. Next up on my list of questions is why the US would use a $600,000 AIM-9X Sidewinder missile to shoot down this balloon when the F-22 carries a 20mm cannon on board that ought to do the job just fine. Well, believe it or not, using guns against a similar balloon has proven ineffective in the past. In 1998, 2 Canadian CF-18s were dispatched to intercept a runaway weather balloon of a somewhat similar size. The two jets fired more than 1,000 20mm rounds from their M61A1 Vulcan autocannons, which amounts to nearly the full magazine carried by both jets combined. And these are not small rounds. We're talking about full-sized 20mm rounds meant for taking down enemy aircraft. But despite poking lots of big holes in the balloon, it stayed airborne and continued to float for days after that. The US obviously wanted this balloon to come down in American territorial waters to make recovery operations as simple as possible. So using a Sidewinder to take it down 6 miles off the coast makes perfect sense. And if you're wondering how they locked onto a balloon using an infrared-guided weapon, you should know that the AIM-9X uses an infrared imaging seeker. In other words, it can really interpret what it's looking at. And it also benefits from a direct data link to the F-22 that launched it. And finally, I want to address concerns that because the US didn't shoot down this balloon before it made landfall over the US, that we've set some sort of dangerous precedent that China now knows they can attack America using balloons. Well, first of all, this isn't even the first time a balloon like this has traversed the US. As the DoD acknowledged earlier this week, it's happened at least 3 times in the past, once earlier in the Biden administration and twice while Trump was in office. But the truth is, this argument doesn't acknowledge the reality of threat assessments, and they don't work like legal precedent. Just because you let 1 balloon or 3 balloons drift over the US doesn't mean the US is obligated to let all other balloons drift over its territory. What it really means is that every threat assessment is different, and if the balloon doesn't appear to pose any actual threat, then taking direct military action isn't always appropriate. But if a balloon did appear to pose a real and legitimate threat, well, then intercepting it and shooting it down earlier would make tons of sense. And the US obviously always has this option regardless of what they've done in the past. In fact, if you really are concerned with the possibility that this is setting some sort of a precedent for future balloon-based attacks, you should be glad that the US didn't respond to this non-threat balloon as though it was one. If the US had responded to this balloon in the very same way that it would if the balloon had been toting a nuclear weapon, well, then we would have just shown China exactly how we would have handled it, giving China the information they'd need to try to mitigate that intercept strategy. In the interest of getting this out today, I'll leave it at that, but let me know if you guys have more questions about this Chinese surveillance balloon story, and I'll do my best to get you some answers. In the meantime, check out YouTube Shorts this week. I'll be posting Sandboxx News Shorts every day this week to see how that performs, and I'd love to know what you guys think about it. And until then, I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure you swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.